You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey there, travelers. Kaylee Cuoco here. Sorry to interrupt your music, great artist BT Dubs, but wouldn't you rather be there to hear it live? With Priceline, you can get out of your dreams and into your dream concert. They've got millions of travel deals to get you to that festival, gig, rave, sound bath, or sonic experience you've been dreaming of. Download the Priceline app today, and you can save up to 60% off hotels and up to 50% off flights. So don't just dream about that trip. Book it with Priceline.
Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 501 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
With the belated truce at Cold Harbor, the Overland Campaign came to a close. The debacle at Cold Harbor ended Ulysses S. Grant's last opportunity to defeat Robert E. Lee in the field, which was Grant's stated goal from the time the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan. But now Grant had run out of room which to maneuver. His offensive, begun a month ago, now reached an uneasy equilibrium in the sandy trenches and rifle pits the two armies occupied between Totopotomoy Creek and the Chickahominy River.
Grant therefore made plans to abandon the overland route in favor of a shift south of the James River, aimed at cutting the railroads connecting Richmond with the Deep South.
This was a different strategy than the one behind the campaign just ended. The objective of the Overland Campaign had been to destroy Lee's army in the open field. The new federal offensive, presently dubbed the Petersburg Campaign, would do so by choking off the logistical lifeblood the Army of Northern Virginia depended upon.
Such an operation had been in the back of Grant's mind since before the Overland Campaign began, but mainly as a Plan B in the event he was unable to defeat Lee north of Richmond.
Since the new campaign would require time to organize, Grant would have the Army of the Potomac hold its entrenchments at Cold Harbor, pinning Lee there, while other federal forces began the isolation of the Army of Northern Virginia by destroying Richmond's rail connections north and west of the city.
Sheridan's Union cavalry would dismantle the Virginia Central Railroad, then link up at Charlottesville with the column under Major General David Hunter, who had relieved the hapless Franz Sigel and was now marching southward up the Shenandoah Valley.
After those operations were completed, Grant told Henry Halleck he would, quote, move the army to the south side of the James River. Once there, I can cut off all sources of supply to the enemy, except what is furnished by the canal. Well, the canal Grant was referring to was the James River Canal, which passed through Lynchburg, an important railroad and logistics center 150 miles west of Richmond. Lynchburg was actually Hunter's ultimate objective, and if he reached it, then the canal would be cut as well.
But Grant was disappointed when neither Hunter's nor Sheridan's expeditions came to much. The Confederate cavalry, led by Wade Hampton, stopped Sheridan at Trevilian Station, a few miles short of Charlottesville. For his part, Hunter got nowhere near Charlottesville, but instead continued his march west of the Blue Ridge Mountains rather than turning east as Grant expected.
As a result, although Hunter defeated a scratch Confederate force at Piedmont on June 6th and soon inflicted severe damage on the Virginia Military Institute at Lexington, he forfeited his chance to wreck the Orange and Alexandria Railroad between Charlottesville and Lynchburg.
Nor did he capture Lynchburg. Instead, on the evening of June 10th, Robert E. Lee detached Jubal Early's corps from the Army and sent it west to Lynchburg by rail.
A week later, Early skirmished with Hunter and drove him into West Virginia, and with that, Old Jube opened a path for a raid north down the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland. Early's strike north embarrassed the Lincoln administration, briefly threatened Washington, and forced the transfer of the entire federal Sixth Corps to deal with the danger to the capital.
By that time, Grant had the Army of the Potomac across the James River by way of the longest pontoon bridge in American military history. In so doing, he stole a march on Lee, but proved unable to capture Petersburg before the rebel army arrived in force to defend the place.
As a result, a new belt of defensive works went up, dwarfing anything seen during the Overland Campaign, and both armies settled in for what would end up being a 10-month siege. For most of that period, the Confederates stubbornly managed to keep open at least one of the Deep South Railroad links with Petersburg. Only on April 2, 1865, a bare week before Appomattox, would the siege of Petersburg finally end. Much of what we just mentioned is still in the future on the podcast, but the point we want to make is that inevitably the lengthy, nearly year-long deadlock at Petersburg colored perceptions of the Overland Campaign. Had Grant's crossing of the James resulted in Petersburg's immediate seizure, as might well have occurred, then the Overland Campaign would have appeared to be the resolute prelude to a brilliant final act. But the months-long stalemate at Petersburg made the Overland Campaign seem like a failure. Even so, Northern disappointment might have been less but for the campaign's appalling butcher's bill. From May 4th through June 12th, the day Grant crossed the James River, the Army of the Potomac, including Burnside's Ninth Corps, lost about 55,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, to say nothing of the other offensives encompassed by Grant's peripheral strategy, which probably lengthened the casualty lists by another 10,000 men.
And for what? Morale plummeted on the northern home front. Grant, many muttered, was nothing but a butcher. The price of gold, which was closely tied to the Federals' battlefield fortunes, nearly doubled, and by the end of the summer, Abraham Lincoln was thinking seriously about what he would do if he lost the November election.
Fortunately for Lincoln, and for Grant's place in history, by the end of the summer, Northern hopes revived. A naval victory at Mobile Bay on the Gulf Coast on August 5th, and especially Sherman's capture of Atlanta on September 2nd, served notice that the Union would eventually prevail.
Additional federal victories followed, ensuring Lincoln's re-election and extinguishing the Confederacy's last hope for independence. In the afterglow of the Union's final triumph, it became possible to see the Virginia campaign of 1864 in a more favorable light.
What had seemed like a defeat, or at best a standoff, could now be viewed as a bold step on the road to ultimate victory. Yet no firm consensus on the campaign emerged. Then and now it remains controversial.
Those who defended Grant's generalship based their case on 4 arguments. First, they maintained he was the first federal commander to deprive Robert E. Lee of the initiative. That is, as soon as Grant took the field, Lee danced to Grant's tune, not the reverse.
Second, Grant's relentless pressure put a severe strain on Lee's army and laid the groundwork for its ultimate surrender. Third, while Grant lost 55,000 men in 1 month, that was no more, proportionally, than Lee lost, and unlike Grant, Lee couldn't replace his losses.
The more imaginative of Grant's defenders have argued that he lost far fewer men to gain a winning position than previous federal commanders in the East. McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade squandered in a succession of futile campaigns.
Finally, Grant's defenders asserted his strategy must be seen in its wider context. In Virginia, he had to pin his Confederate adversary to prevent Lee from sending reinforcements to aid Joe Johnston down in Georgia, as had happened the previous year when Longstreet had been sent south and arrived in time to help Braxton Bragg win the Battle of Chickamauga.
Grant also had to shield Washington, which necessitated a strategy such as the Overland Campaign, rather than making an immediate amphibious jump that would have taken the army to the south side of the James River.
And he had to maintain a pressure on Lee persistent enough that it wouldn't adversely affect Lincoln's chance for re-election. Well, Grant accomplished all these goals, thereby helping ensure that Sherman took Atlanta and that Lincoln got re-elected for a second term. Furthermore, he had planned all along for the possibility that he might have to defeat Lee through a siege-like attritional struggle. And that, maintained his defenders, showed uncommon foresight.
Grant's detractors conceded some of these points. Yes, he deprived Lee of the initiative, placed a crippling strain on Lee's army, and ultimately pinned Lee in the Petersburg trenches. But nevertheless, to them, Grant's strategy had seemed at best unimaginative and at worst a waste of soldiers' lives.
Writing in 1884, John C. Ropes, a gifted amateur historian of the Civil War, caustically pronounced the Overland Campaign a failure. Quote, "With any resources less than those of the United States, the campaign, as Grant conducted it, must have come to a dead halt. It was so wasteful, so thoughtless of men's lives, that it required large reinforcements, an adversary numerically much weaker, and very patient and much enduring soldiers."
Confederates agreed. In the words of artillerist E. Porter Alexander, Grant, quote, was no intellectual genius, but he understood arithmetic. He knew that if 100,000 men couldn't defeat Lee, 200,000 might, and that 300,000 would make quite sure to do it. That was the game which he deliberately set out to play.
Or, as Jefferson Davis tartly put it in his memoirs, Grant could afford a policy of attrition since he could replace his losses while Lee could not. However, Davis continued, quote, "To those who can approve the policy of attrition without reference to the number of lives it might cost, this may seem justifiable, but it can hardly be regarded as generalship."
This interpretation continues to have adherents. By contrast, most scholars have concurred that Robert E. Lee's handling of the Overland Campaign was a defensive masterpiece. But if so, it was a defensive masterpiece by default, since during the campaign, Lee constantly itched for a chance to unleash on Grant the same trademark, crushing counterattack that he had administered to McClellan, Pope, and Hooker.
Lee came close to his goal on May 6th when Longstreet arrived on the Orange Plank Road and rolled up Hancock's line, to use Hancock's words, like a wet blanket. But critics have pointed out that because of a faulty pre-campaign deployment, Longstreet's two divisions nearly reached the field too late. Had their arrival been delayed by even an hour, or had Burnside come up in support of Hancock as planned, then Lee probably would have met with a clear defeat in the Wilderness.
As it was, the Wilderness ended in a tactical stalemate, with Grant still in possession of the initiative, something none of Lee's previous adversaries had managed to retain after the initial fighting between the two armies.
Lee spent the rest of the campaign furiously trying to wrestle the initiative away from Grant. His efforts, though unsuccessful, were costly. A recent reappraisal of Confederate losses during the Overland Campaign suggests that the Army of Northern Virginia lost 11,125 casualties in the Wilderness, 12,450 at Spotsylvania, and just over 1,500 along the North Anna. As a result, by the time significant opportunities to counterattack presented themselves, particularly at Bethesda Church on May 30th and June 2nd, the rebel army lacked sufficient strength to capitalize on them.
All in all, the Army of Northern Virginia lost almost 33,000 men killed, wounded, and missing during the Overland Campaign, a ratio of loss to original strength as severe as that of the Army of the Potomac.
The best that can be said of Lee's performance in the campaign is that he evaded Grant's attempt to destroy him between the Rapidan and the James. In all other respects, he fell short of both his own expectations and the objective requirements for success.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Are you looking for a deeper connection to history and want to make an impact in your community? Well, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a charitable, fraternal organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the heroes who fought to save the Union and end slavery.
With values of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, from powerful bonds of brotherhood to rich traditions and rituals, the SUVCW offers its members the opportunity to participate in meaningful relationships and advance important causes, and are encouraged to be involved in community leadership.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of veterans and non-descendants. To learn more, visit suvcw.org, or you can email join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
The Disney Plus Hulu HBO Max bundle. Plans starting at just $16.99 a month.
No one will ever break us apart.
Catch Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts: The New Avengers on Disney Plus.
You can't escape the past.
Alien Earth on Hulu.
This ship collected monsters.
And Final Destination: Bloodlines on HBO Max.
Death is coming for our family.
The Disney Plus Hulu HBO Max bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. All these and more streaming soon. Visit Disney Plus Hulu HBO Max bundle.com for details.
However one assesses their performance, the success or failure of the Virginia campaign didn't rest on the shoulders of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee alone. Their principal subordinates also played a vital role, and in this respect, Grant was often poorly served.
For example, the subsidiary federal offensives in Western Virginia that were part of Grant's peripheral strategy came to little. William Averill retreated without inflicting significant damage on the Confederate salt and lead mines in southwestern Virginia. George Crook destroyed Dublin Depot and the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad Bridge across the New River, but then he tamely withdrew, thereby easing the pressure on the Confederates in that region.
In the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel was completely out of his depth. No reason except sheer incompetence can account for his defeat at Newmarket. David Hunter's subsequent advance up the valley showed the ease with which Confederate opposition there could be swept aside, although Hunter presently committed some foolish blunders of his own.
Benjamin Butler's failed Bermuda Hundred operation is often placed in the same category with Sigel's Newmarket debacle. But the fact is, Butler had a more difficult assignment than Sigel and performed it better than is usually conceded. Grant's written instructions called for Butler to seize City Point, then advance toward Richmond, quote, holding close to the south bank of the James River as you advance.
Executing those orders required Butler to place his Army of the James squarely between the Richmond garrison and the substantial Confederate forces arriving from the Carolinas, giving him two threats to worry about from opposite directions.
That arrangement would have been awkward for even a seasoned combat general. In retrospect, an advance by way of the north bank of the James would have been more prudent, but Grant's instructions ruled this out. Nevertheless, until mid-May, Butler pinned down practically all the reinforcements earmarked for Lee's army, by which time Grant, according to his original timetable, was supposed to have beaten Lee or shoved him back into the defenses of Richmond. Even after the Drury's Bluff defeat, the Army of the James distracted thousands of rebel troops. More important, it complicated the Confederate military problem by maintaining a standing threat against the Richmond-Petersburg rail connection.
A second criticism leveled at the Bermuda Hundred operation was the awkward command arrangement whereby professionals like Major Generals Baldy Smith and Quincy Gilmore were to supply Butler with sound tactical advice to offset his inexperience in the field.
A better alternative, as Bernard and Meigs suggested after their tour of inspection, would have been to leave Butler in administrative charge of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina while placing Baldy Smith in command in the field. But this common-sense solution was thwarted by Butler's desire to handle troops in combat and Smith being temperamentally unsuited to play second fiddle to an amateur political general like Butler. Well, Grant would ultimately solve the problem by stripping Baldy Smith's 18th Corps away from Butler and sending it off to operate with the Army of the Potomac. Unfortunately, this was done so hastily that, as we saw, 18th Corps was, in effect, mislaid by Grant's staff and arrived at Cold Harbor exhausted and short of ammunition. As a result, it played an indecisive role at Cold Harbor, while the remaining troops back at Bermuda Hundred were placed firmly on the defensive, so they no longer posed a significant threat to Richmond or Petersburg.
Perhaps even more awkward than the Army of the James command arrangement between Butler, Smith, and Gilmore was the one between Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade.
It's true that some of Meade's letters home to his wife betray understandable irritation at the way in which Grant's presence with the Army overshadowed him. But in these circumstances, it's probably not fair to judge a man by what he writes to loved ones in unguarded moments. Here, better to look at what Grant thought of Meade's performance, and seen in this light, Meade comes off rather well.
On May 13th, Grant recommended Meade, together with Sherman, for promotion to Major General in the regular army. He wrote, quote, "General Meade has more than met my most hopeful expectations. He and Sherman are the fittest officers for large commands I have come in contact with."
When some of his staff suggested that Meade occupied an inconvenient role and that it wasted time to issue orders through him instead of directly to the Army of the Potomac's corps commanders, well, Grant deflected their arguments by saying that as general-in-chief, he didn't want to get drawn into the day-to-day direction of a single field army. And besides, he couldn't afford to dismiss a general who had served a long time with the Army of the Potomac and knew its subordinate officers well, and at Gettysburg had won the Army's only clear-cut victory over Robert E. Lee. Besides, Grant said, Meade, quote, "is capable and perfectly subordinate, and by attending to details, he relieves me of much unnecessary work and gives me more time to think and mature my general plans. I will always see that he gets full credit for what he does."
Whether Grant actually saw to it that Meade got full credit for his efforts is debatable, but the two generals worked smoothly together. The real problem in the command arrangements between Grant and Meade lay not in their personal relationship, but in their contrasting command styles.
By temperament and experience, Ulysses S. Grant's style of generalship aimed to shape any outcome toward a desired objective. As he demonstrated time and again at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, Grant was able to adapt to changing, even adverse circumstances, while always keeping his eye on the prize. The classic example of this during the Overland Campaign is the turn south after the Wilderness, a battle which historians have rightly pointed out was as bad a setback for Federal arms as the Battle of Chancellorsville. However, Grant's style of generalship displayed no fear of improvisation, encouraged a calmer, faster reaction to surprising events, and, in fact, showed a keen appreciation for the unpredictable nature of war.
By contrast, George Meade's essential command philosophy was based on the assumption that good generalship consists in control, that is, to use resources and to manipulate variables so as to guarantee success. However, since in war, almost by definition, this is impossible, the next best thing is to seek to win by avoiding losing.
This mentality was squarely in the McClellan-esque tradition that shaped not only Meade, but almost every one of his infantry corps commanders. And Grant perceived the grip of this tradition on the Army of the Potomac's generals, but he underestimated its strength. He thought that simply by guiding Meade, he could force the army to adapt to his style. But George Meade never caught Grant's vision. Though he obeyed Grant's orders like a good soldier, he was never a true partner in the way that Sherman had been in the West, or that Sheridan would increasingly become in the East.
Meade's instincts were reflected in his infantry corps commanders, whose distinguishing characteristic was a cautious, half-defensive mindset that complemented not at all the demands of a campaign aimed at the destruction of Lee's army.
Perhaps the most intriguing Federal Corps commander was Gouverneur K. Warren. He was neither casual in the performance of his duty, as Sedgwick seemed to be, nor was he inept, like Burnside. Nor did he get disoriented by reversals in the way that Wright occasionally did. But Warren was notoriously less dependable than Hancock, often because he had an irritating way of doing the wrong things for the right reasons.
Warren was prone to rebel against things he was called upon to do when he didn't agree with or understand the reasons behind the orders he received. Unfortunately, he employed this stubbornness more often to second-guess his superiors than to pitch aggressively into the enemy.
The worst example of this behavior occurred on June 1st, when Warren failed to attack Confederates marching across the front of his Fifth Corps lines, or counterattack Early's Corps after the second fight at Bethesda Church. Such failures infuriated Grant. After all, the whole point of the campaign was to get the rebels to fight in the open, and he expected the Army's corps commanders to seize every opportunity to do so when such chances presented themselves.
Of all the Federal Corps commanders, only Sheridan did notably well during the Overland Campaign, and then only on his own terms, following a debut in the Wilderness that was, at best, insubordinate and, at worst, grossly negligent.
Fortunately for Little Phil, Ulysses S. Grant was an indulgent patron, since Meade would undoubtedly have removed him from command and quite possibly court-martialed him as well after Sheridan's blow-up on May 8th. Well, Sheridan obviously preferred raiding over screening and reconnaissance, and under him the Union cavalry began a swift transformation from auxiliary arm to one of the principal factors in the Federals' ultimate victory.
During the Virginia campaign, senior leadership on the Confederate side was generally better than for the Federals, particularly in the subsidiary operations.
John C. Breckinridge and P.G.T. Beauregard clearly outclassed Franz Sigel and Benjamin Butler. Breckinridge's performance at Newmarket was a small masterpiece, and Beauregard performed a vital service in defeating Butler. It's not at all clear that another general, for example George Pickett or Robert Ransom, could have done what Beauregard did. All in all, Robert E. Lee was fortunate to have the assistance of such capable officers. They derailed Grant's peripheral strategy and ensured that by late May, Lee had received a major infusion of reinforcements just when he most urgently needed it.
Regrettably for Lee, his good fortune in having Breckinridge and Beauregard assist him was largely offset by the mediocre performance of his three corps commanders.
As on many battlefields, A.P. Hill exercised a disappointingly weak grip on his divisions. Dick Ewell served effectively in the Wilderness, but lost Lee's confidence thereafter, particularly when on May 12th, Ewell was unhinged by the shocking losses suffered by Allegheny Johnson's division.
After Longstreet's wounding, Richard Anderson made an impressive debut as 1st Corps commander at Laurel Hill, but then performed indifferently, particularly during the fizzled June 1st attack at Cold Harbor, which robbed Lee of the opportunity to launch the major counterattack that he'd yearned for since the beginning of the campaign.
Jeb Stuart's skillful screening of Lee's army turned to tragedy when he chose to fight Sheridan on singularly unfavorable terms at Yellow Tavern. All in all, only 2 of Lee's senior commanders did well in the Overland Campaign, but for different reasons, they had little opportunity to shine. James Longstreet was knocked out of action when he was severely wounded by friendly fire in the Wilderness, and by the time Jubal Early replaced Ewell in command of 2nd Corps, that formation had been so badly bled by hard fighting that old Jube's aggressive, well-conceived attacks at Bethesda Church resulted in little but additional casualties.
Even with the uneven performance of his corps commanders, Robert E. Lee likely would have been able to contain the Federals between Spotsylvania and the North Anna, if not for Union sea power, which was in many respects the Confederates' most dangerous nemesis.
The Bermuda Hundred operation would obviously have been impossible without Union control of the seas, but the Overland Campaign was just as dependent on supply bases at Belle Plaine, Port Royal, and White House Landing. So without the Federals' control of the sea and key waterways, Grant would have had a far more difficult time turning Lee out of his formidable defensive positions.
That represented a fine exploitation of superior northern resources. However, a resource that was underutilized during the campaign was one that marched with the Army of the Potomac everywhere it went. That is, a 9th Corps division led by Brigadier General Edward Ferrero, 2/3 of which was composed of black soldiers.
At a time when Halleck was sending to the front lines every available replacement and reinforcement, some 48,000 men went forward during the course of the campaign, Ferrero's division stayed in the rear to guard supply wagons. Apart from a few brushes with Confederate cavalry and rebel guerrillas, it remained as distant from the fighting as if it had been on the moon.
The reason for this, of course, had everything to do with white assumptions about blacks. Even Grant, who in the West found that black troops performed capably in battle, still had reservations about them, and the officers in the Army of the Potomac had even more.
In the end, though, few would remember the failure to use Ferrero's troops, nor would many consider the utilization of Union sea power or the vital contribution, for good or ill, of the key Federal and Confederate subordinates. Instead, the spring 1864 Virginia campaign would be recalled primarily as a great duel between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, and this framing of the campaign, more than anything else, was responsible for the creation of the popular image of Grant the Butcher.
This image is unfair. Grant's Vicksburg campaign and his pursuit of Lee from Petersburg to Appomattox are two classic examples of bold, fast-moving warfare. And even during the Overland Campaign, it was no part of Grant's strategy to win by attrition. He honestly believed that he had Lee on the ropes and that a few good hard knocks would destroy the rebel army.
Yet the label of butcher has stuck, in no small measure because so many have reasons to cherish the image of Grant the pitiless, head-down fighter. To begin with, back in the day, Grant partisans, confronted with the campaign as it actually panned out, put the best face on it that they could. Also, 20th century military historians saw an attrition strategy as tough-minded and modern. But perhaps the most enduring wellspring of the butcher image has come from Southerners, not merely to disparage Grant, but to create and sustain the myth of the lost cause.
The Lost Cause is a romanticized and inaccurate interpretation of the American Civil War that minimizes the role of slavery and glorifies the Confederacy. It emerged after the war as a way for white Southerners to reconcile defeat and maintain a positive view of their past, while distorting historical facts to paint the Confederacy as a noble cause fighting for states' rights and honorable ideals rather than the preservation of slavery.
According to the Lost Cause, the Confederacy was defeated because the Union had far more soldiers, industrial capacity, and economic resources, while Confederate soldiers are portrayed as valiant and honorable, fighting for a just cause despite facing insurmountable odds. It should be obvious then how the contest between Grant and Lee during the Overland Campaign would fit into the mythology of the Lost Cause. The task of the mythmakers was to demonstrate how Lee outgeneraled Grant at every turn, and so the mythic reading of the campaign is simple. Lee shrewdly traps Grant in the wilderness, where the federal advantages in manpower and artillery will count for less. Grant suffers the equivalent of a Chancellorsville-like defeat, but doggedly refuses to retreat, and instead tries to slip around Lee's flank.
Lee anticipates the move and blocks Grant at Spotsylvania. Grant again loses heavily, draws off, and shifts another time around Lee's flank. Lee once more anticipates this move and parries so adroitly that Grant has no choice but to shift a third time.
This third shift culminates in Cold Harbor, a shatteringly one-sided Confederate victory. But Grant simply slips once again around Lee's flank, crosses the James River, and attacks Petersburg. Although Lee defeats this effort, he is now effectively pinned to the defense of Richmond/Petersburg, where with dwindling men and resources, he staves off defeat for another 10 months. Well, the emphasis in this interpretation of events is on Lee's superior generalship and Grant's superior numbers, which enable Grant to absorb successive losses and still press south. The outcome is inevitable and classically summed up by E. Porter Alexander, who said, quote, "However bold we might be, however desperately we might fight, we were sure in the end to be worn out. It was only a question of a few months, more or less."
Alexander at least was willing to give Grant credit for a well-conducted campaign, but most Southerners weren't so generous. Typical were the words of Edward Pollard, editor of the Richmond Examiner newspaper, and in 1866, author of one of the earliest Southern histories of the war, titled The Lost Cause.
Pollard ascribed to Grant a, quote, coarse, heavy obstinacy, which, quote, contained no spark of military genius. Pollard summed up Grant's strategy during the Overland Campaign by writing that, quote, he had no conception of battle beyond the momentum of numbers. Such was the man who marshaled all the material resources of the North to conquer the little army and overcome the consummate skill of General Lee. He who was declared the military genius of the North had so little idea of the contest, such little appreciation of the higher aims and intellectual exercises of war, that he proposed to decide it by mere competition in the sacrifice of human life.
This mythical interpretation insinuated itself into most analyses of the campaign. Thus, although Lee outgeneraled him at every step, Grant ultimately prevailed, but only doing so through sheer weight of numbers.
Why this insistence on Lee's having outgeneraled Grant? Well, for white Southerners, Lee was the embodiment of the Confederate cause. If Lee, the South's paladin, met defeat only because of the weight of overwhelming numbers, then surely he and the Confederacy had gone down manfully. To allow that Grant was the superior general in his own right, and that Grant's generalship, as well as his superior numbers, explained Lee's defeat, would have obscured the mythical impact of a just, righteous Confederacy unflinchingly meeting its fate.
This interpretation began to take hold even as the campaign was underway. In May and June, newspapers such as the Richmond Examiner and Charleston Mercury insisted that, in effect, Grant was beaten but too stupid to know it.
Grant's offensive did reach stalemate at Petersburg by the end of June, and as this recognition set in, the North became discouraged enough that in August Lincoln predicted his own defeat in November's presidential election. But victories at Mobile Bay, Atlanta, and in the Shenandoah Valley dispelled the gloominess and showed convincingly that Federal arms were winning the war. Then Hood's disastrous defeat in front of Nashville in December 1864 wrecked the Army of Tennessee and made it almost impossible for the Confederates to stop Sherman in his northward march through the Carolinas to join Grant in early 1865.
However, none of these Federal victories or Confederate failures are part of the Lost Causes explanation for the South's defeat. The mythical focus has remained firmly on Lee and his duel with Grant, a duel in which Robert E. Lee outgeneraled his adversary at every turn, but nevertheless went down under the weight of the Yankees' overwhelming numbers.
As regarded Grant, this interpretation required only a slight shift from the wartime emphasis on Grant, the stupid, unworthy, unsuccessful butcher, to the post-war portrayal of Grant as the successful, but still stupid and unworthy, butcher. The events of the Overland Campaign became a natural focus of this interpretation, a storyline that played up Lee's valor, foresight, and crafty generalship, as opposed to Grant's clumsiness, doggedness, and superior numbers. And historians have been seduced into repeating the basic tenets of this myth and guilty of failing to look beyond it. The most obvious example is the duel motif itself. Many accounts of what happened in Virginia in the spring of 1864 barely mention Grant's peripheral strategy and take little notice of Butler at Bermuda Hundred, Sigel in the Valley, or Crook and Averill in southwestern Virginia, to say nothing of subsequent cavalry raids by Sheridan and August Kautz. Most accounts continue to emphasize the duel between Grant and Lee and relegate the other operations to sideshows, with little attempt to analyze it all as Grant and Lee did, that is, as an integrated whole. In the end, the story of the Overland Campaign, to be told completely, has to include more than the duel between Lee and Grant, and must break free of the grip the Lost Causes interpretation of the campaign has exerted upon the historical narrative.
Starting in Virginia and Georgia in the spring of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant began to implement a truly war-winning strategy, which he summed up this way, quote, "The art of war is simple. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can and as often as you can, and keep moving on."
And Grant did just that during the Overland Campaign. He kept moving on. He refused to give up the initiative. He was unafraid to mix things up and go toe-to-toe with Robert E. Lee. And when all was said and done, Grant would take the Army of the Potomac across the James River, a move which so threatened Richmond and Petersburg that by Lee's own admission, it heralded the death knell of the Confederacy.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is The Myth of the Lost Cause and Civil War History, edited by Gary W. Gallagher and Alan T. Nolan.
This volume contains 9 essays about the Lost Cause and is an excellent starting point for anyone who wants to learn more about the myth itself and how it took hold in the American consciousness.
As always, you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over at Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way. Just yesterday, we released members episode number 162, in which we look at the stories of some of the soldiers who faced military justice for their actions during the Overland Campaign, including one officer who was hiding behind a tree, except for a certain part of his anatomy which he stuck out, declaring he hoped he'd get shot there so he would get out of the fighting. Anyway, we hope the members of the Strawfoot Brigade enjoy listening to that episode, including the newest members, Michael M., William A., and Manny.
Thanks for your support, guys. And a big thank you also to Tom V. and Erwin J. for their donations. We also wanted to say thank you to Neil B. for sending a very special gift our way.
All right. Well, that's a lot of thank yous, but we appreciate all the support and encouragement, including all the wonderful comments and messages we got after episode number 500. You guys are great. Okay, well, thanks to all of you who listened to this very long episode. We appreciate you sticking with us through the Overland Campaign. And hey, next up, as promised, will be the Atlanta Campaign. So we're going to be heading down to Georgia. Well, we're looking forward to that and hope you are too. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.